This is a matter of interim while he's getting that set up.
Shoot. Okay. So I thought we would look at a classic work. I've never actually read this before now. We hear things quoted from it. So we're going to start this study. This is C.S. Lewis, of course. He, and I think as we'll see in the preface that we'll read to this work, he was a member of the Church of England, from what I understand, but he tries to be, non-denominational, which, I can appreciate that. Of course, we're non-denominational in the absolute sense. So we like to stay away from the various dogmas that human beings invent. But I think he makes a lot of good points, and that's the thing I would like to talk about are some of the overreaching ideas that C.S. Lewis brings up. I wasn't sure exactly where to start. Of course, this is a picture of C.S. Lewis, and the picture on the left is a photograph of one of the original copies of the Mere Christianity book. Now, of course, the book itself comes from a compilation of radio broadcasts that he did. And I've got a couple of things that I'm going to start with. Not sure exactly which one to go to first. But I have a foreword to the book that's written by a third party. So let me read that, I guess. So this book, Mere Christianity, is a book that begs to be seen in its historical context as a bold act of storytelling and healing in a world gone mad. In 1942, just 24 years after the end of a brutal war that destroyed an entire generation of its young men, Great Britain was at war again. Now, as ordinary citizens who suffered as their small island nation was bombarded by 400 planes a night in the infamous Blitz that changed the face of war, turning civilians and their cities into the front lines. As a young man, C.S. Lewis had served in the awful trenches of World War I, and in 1940, when the bombing of Britain began, he took up duties as an air raid warden and gave talks to men in the Royal Air Force who knew that after just 13 bombing missions, most of them would be declared dead or missing. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine C.S. Lewis as well? You come off of World War I, and now we're about to enter into World War II. I thought COVID was bad, right? Could you imagine having to endure that every few years? Could you imagine the mindset of someone that had lived through World War II, and that was a horrific war? So he took up duties as an air raid warden and gave talks to men in the Royal Air Force who knew that after just 13 bombing missions, most of them would be declared dead or missing. Their situation prompted Lewis to speak about the problems of suffering, pain, and evil, work that resulted in his being invited by the BBC to give a series of wartime broadcasts on Christian faith. Delivered over the air from 1942 to 1944, these speeches eventually were gathered into the book we know today as Mere Christianity. The writer here says, this book then doesn't consist of academic philosophical musings. Rather, it's a work of oral literature addressed to people at war. And that's something that it really behooves us to remember as we read through this, that the time frame, the things that were going on outside of this book. How strange it must have been to turn on the radio, which was every day bringing news of death and unspeakable destruction, and hear one man talking in an intelligent, good-humored, and probing tone about decent and humane behavior, fair play, and the importance of knowing right from wrong. Asked by the BBC to explain to his fellow Britons what Christians believe, C.S. Lewis proceeded with the task as if it were the simplest thing in the world and also the most important. I think I might cut it short there. Well, let me mention this. Speaking with no authority but that of experience, as a layman and a former atheist, C.S. Lewis told his radio audience that he had been selected for the job of describing Christianity to a new generation precisely because he was not a specialist but an amateur and a beginner, not an old hand. He told friends that he had accepted the task because he believed that England, which had come to consider itself part of a post-Christian world, I mean, all the way back then, of course, it's clear today that they are definitely consider themselves post-Christian. But even back then, had never, in fact, been told in basic terms what the religion is about. Like Soren Kierkegaard before him and contemporary Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lewis seeks in Mere Christianity to help us see the religion with fresh eyes as a radical faith whose adherents might be likened to an underground group gathering in a war zone, a place where evil seems to have the upper hand, to hear messages of hope from the other side. All right, so I'm going to conclude the little introduction there. I thought that was pretty interesting. And one more thing before we actually start getting into the book itself. I could only find, and this claims to be the only surviving audio of C.S. Lewis's broadcast talks. So I just wanted to play about 5 minutes of him talking because he introduces a couple of pretty interesting things that we'll talk about more later. But I just thought it'd be fascinating. You know, you can hear the man himself and what it would have been like to hear him on the radio. So I'm just going to play this over the microphone just for a moment, a couple minutes.
These talks, I've had to say a good deal about prayer. And before going on to my main subject tonight, I'd like to deal with the difficulty some people find about the whole idea of prayer. Somebody put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I can't swallow is this idea of him listening to several 100 billion human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I find quite a lot of people feel that difficulty. Well, the first thing to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words, at the same moment. Most of us can imagine a God attending to any number of claimants, if only they come one by one, and he has an endless time to do it in. So what's really at the back of the difficulty is this idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time. Well, that, of course, is what happens to us. Our life comes to us moment by moment. One moment disappears before the next comes along, and there's room for precious little in each. That's what time is like. And of course, you and I tend to take it for granted that this time series, this arrangement of past, present, and future, isn't simply the way life comes to us, but is the way all things really exist. We tend to assume that the whole universe and God himself are always moving on from a past to a future, just as we are. But many learned men don't agree with that. I think it was the theologians who first started the idea that some things are not in time at all. Later, the philosophers took it over, and now some of the scientists are doing the same. Almost certainly, God is not in time. His life doesn't 10:30 tonight, he hasn't got to listen to them all in that one little snippet which we call 10:30. 10:30, and every other moment from the beginning to the end of the world is always the present for him. If you like to put it that way, he has infinity in which to listen to the split second of prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes in flames. That's difficult, I know. Can I try to give something not the same, but a bit like it? Suppose I'm writing a novel. I write, Mary laid down her book. Next moment came a knock at the door. For Mary, who's got to live in the imaginary time of the story, there's no interval between putting down the book and hearing the knock. But I, her creator, between writing the first part of that sentence and the second, may have gone out for an hour's walk, spent the whole hour thinking about Mary. I know that's not a perfect example, but it may just give a glimpse of what I mean.
I'm going to stop it there, but I mean, I really like the way he thinks. I really like the kinds of ideas that he puts forth. And of course, these are all biblical ideas. You know, God is timeless. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. But I like that. I like that imagery that he evokes when he says that, you know, all these millions of people praying to God, and yet he has time to listen to every single one in detail. He has all the time in the universe, infinity time. So I know we talk about that kind of thing sometimes, but I thought, you know, that's really, really a good point. But anyway, that's what he sounds like. So you just imagine, you know, that voice with me kind of narrating this. Would you like for me to? Would you like for me to speak with a British accent? I practiced a little bit, but it's just not going to work. So there's the intro slide, The Law of Human Nature. This is Mere Christianity, Book 1, Chapter 1. There's actually a preface. I guess I could read. I guess I should read some of that. Now, this is his writing. He actually wrote this, and he wrote this saying that basically what we've already said, that the contents of the book were first given on the air and then published in 3 separate parts as Broadcast Talks, Christian Behavior, and Beyond Personality in 1942, 43, and 44. And then they were compiled into this book. And he talks about, as a writer might, he critiques himself and says that when he was talking on the radio, he was using contractions and he was using the kind of conversational wording that he would use when he speaks, and it wasn't as formal as when he's writing. Of course, you know, even when he's speaking, it seems kind of formal to us, being so many decades removed from him. But anyway, he talks about that for a bit. I wanted to point this out, though. He says this a little bit further down. The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between 2 Christian denominations. You will not learn from me whether you ought to become an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, or a Roman Catholic. He says, there's no mystery about my own position. I am a very ordinary layman of the Church of England, not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. But in this book, I'm not trying to convert anyone to my own position. Ever since I have become a Christian, I have the thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. I had more than one reason for thinking this. In the first place, the questions which divide Christians from one another often involve points of theology or even ecclesiastical history, which ought never to be treated except by real experts. Now here, he's deferring to the so-called experts. I would say that we ought to just jettison all of those things altogether. So they shouldn't even come into the equation if we're talking about Christianity. Really the only guide that we should have is the Bible. So he's trying to be, I guess, universal. He's trying to appeal, as a lot of churches do nowadays. They try to appeal, again, in the non-denominational way to everyone. And usually what they end up doing is really satisfying no one, because there's just nothing left. When we come down to the common denominator, there's so much that you have to cut out. There's so many things that people don't agree on. If you leave everything out, you're leaving out things that are actually biblical. So again, I do applaud, though. I do appreciate what he's trying to do. And the fact that he was able to be invited by the BBC to broadcast this to all of these people, the British people. No, I don't think so. I really don't. You're lucky that you get somebody to give an opening prayer to some of these goings on. So, but I do appreciate what he's trying to do, and I think he makes a lot of good points. But again, I'm pointing this out because he's trying to, stay away from doctrinal matters, which actually I do agree. He mentioned specifically, for instance, he mentioned specifically. Well, let me just read his words. He mentions some examples, which we'll get to in just a moment. He says, we ought not to, divide ourselves by and of course we would agree with that. We should not, as Christians, be dividing ourselves on points of theology or ecclesiastical history, because really, unless it's in the Bible, if it's, I think the Catholic Church does that a lot, and we would perhaps use them as the example of ecclesiastical history. They would have certain things that they have established through, their historical, the popes and what they've done, that sort of thing, which of course we would say it's really irrelevant. We have the Word of God, and we follow it exclusively. So we're not worried about what somebody, did 200 years ago. We're interested in what God said to us in the Bible. He says, I should have been out of my depth in such waters, more in need of help myself than to help others. Secondly, we must admit that the discussion of these disputed points has no tendency at all to bring an outsider into the Christian fold. So long as we write and talk about them, we are much more likely to deter him from entering any Christian communion than to draw him into our own. Our divisions should never be discussed except in the presence of those who have already come to believe that there is one God and that Jesus Christ is his only Son. Of course, there are those that would dispute that. So, again, it's you have to walk a fine line there. He mentioned specifically some things that might offend Catholics, that if you were to side with Catholics, it would offend non-Catholics and vice versa. He says, I'm just trying to avoid all of those controversies. He says, some people draw unwarranted conclusions to the fact that I never say more about, Mary, the Virgin Mary, as some call her, than is involved in asserting the virgin birth of Christ. But surely my reason for not doing so is obvious. To say more would take me at once into highly controversial regions. And there is no controversy between Christians which needs to be so delicately touched as this. The Roman Catholic beliefs on that subject are held not only with the ordinary fervor that attaches to all sincere religious belief, but very naturally with the peculiar and, as it were, chivalrous sensibility that a man feels when the honor of his mother or his beloved is at stake. It It's very difficult so to dissent from them that you will not appear to them a cad as well as a heretic. And contrariwise, the opposed Protestant beliefs on this subject call forth feelings which go down to the very roots of all monotheism whatsoever, or whatever. To radical Protestants, it seems that the distinction between creator and creature, however holy, is imperiled, that polytheism is risen against. So I think what he's getting at there, without saying it explicitly, is, the idea that, Mary is somehow part of the Godhead, that she is deity. And he's trying to avoid all of those kind of discussions. Again, in these radio broadcasts, he's trying to appeal to a wide swath, to everyone. And so he avoids those kinds of arguments.
Chris,
Yes, sir.
at the risk of sounding like a cad, I would say what he accomplished in Mere Christianity was wonderful. The idea of appealing to atheists in particular,
Sure.
to establish theism, belief in God. That's the whole essence of the title, is Mere Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just talking about the barest of all Christianity.
Exactly.
Which is also, it's a strong point for simply reaching atheists during those talks. But we all realize there has to come a point, and usually soon after one converts from atheism to theism, where the whole issue of special revelation arises. Where has God, the Creator, communicated? They take us right back to the question of Scripture, and then questions of Scripture have to do with its fundamental authority as well as biblical interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
So you cannot put off forever, or even for very long, some of those issues. And the issue of Mariolatry versus, Protestant views is much deeper than just a chivalrous feeling that a Catholic might have for protecting the Virgin.
Certainly.
It has to do with their claims that the Holy See, the Pope of Rome, is the final authority, whereas we know Scripture is. And that should be always a part of our apologetic outreach, our Christian evidences. So the argument he's going to make about the moral argument that is for the existence of God, I think is unsurpassed in English literature, for all the stuff I've read.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get to that point, then it's time for us to move on from Lewis very quickly, and get into some things that cannot be avoided, have to be discussed.
Certainly. And I think that's the point, is that, and again, the reason to point these things out is he doesn't get into, he kind of touches the hem of the garment on a lot of issues. And I do appreciate the fact that he's laying out logical arguments. These are the underpinnings of the apologetics that we want to use with others. But again, he was definitely a specific flavor of Christian. He was an ist, yeah. So, yeah, I definitely agree with that. Again, this is just him, he's prefacing and, making sure everybody understands what his purpose is. So, he actually mentions here, and I'll mention this too, he says, the danger clearly was that I should put forward as common Christianity anything that was peculiar to the Church of England, or worse still, to myself. I tried to guard against this by sending the original script of what is now Book 2 to 4 clergymen, an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, and a Catholic, and asked for their criticism. The Methodist thought I had not said enough about faith. The Roman Catholic thought I had gone rather too far about the comparative unimportance of theories and explanation of the atonement. Otherwise, all 5 of us were agreed. I did not have the remaining books similarly vetted because in them, though differences might arise among Christians, these would be differences between individuals or schools of thought and not between denominations. I just thought that was kind of interesting. He actually, tried to get some feedback from various denominations. They pretty much fell into line as to what you would think that they would complain about. Because all of these denominations have various axes to grind, and that's kind of the problem. They get hung up on the things that make them unique, which are, their hobby horses, if you will. It's their platform they stand on. And really what we ought to be looking at here is the things that bring them together, that unite them. And I think we've talked about that ourselves. We'd like to find common ground with some of the religious folks in this community. But you have to, again, walk that fine line between finding common ground and compromise. We clearly can't compromise the truth. And that's why we just have to fall back on, look, let's all agree that the Bible is God's word, and that's what we're going to use as our standard. And we're not going to introduce any other kinds of doctrines. We're not going to try and pick out any one particular thing as being more important, because it's all important. If it's in the Bible, clearly, if it's mentioned once, it's just as important as if it's mentioned a dozen times. So let's see. Anything else I want to mention from... So again, he does point out in the last part here, in Book 3, which deals with morals, I have passed over some things in silence, but for a different reason. He says, he's not perfect, and he doesn't want to, upset people by being dogmatic about certain things. He wants for people to understand the truth, to kind of lead them in that direction, but he's not trying to, I guess, convict people per se of things that perhaps he himself is guilty of. There's an interesting section here that he talks about the meaning of words and how they can lose their meaning. I'll just briefly mention this. I thought it was interesting. The word gentleman originally meant something recognizable, one who had a coat of arms and some landed property. That's what you meant by gentleman. When you called someone a gentleman, you weren't paying him a compliment, but merely stating a fact. If you said he was not a gentleman, you weren't insulting him, but just giving information. There was no contradiction in saying that John was a liar and a gentleman, any more than that, or any more than there is now in saying that James is a fool and an M.A. But then there came people who said, so rightly, charitably, spiritually, sensitively, so anything but usefully. But surely the important thing about a gentleman is not the coat of arms and the land, but the behavior. Surely he is the true gentleman who behaves as a gentleman should. Surely in that sense, Edward is far more truly a gentleman than John. They meant well. To be honorable and courteous and brave is, of course, a far better thing to have a coat of arms, but it's not the same thing. Worse still, it's not a thing that everyone will agree about. To call a man a gentleman in this new refined sense becomes, in fact, not a way of giving information about him, but a way of praising him. To deny that he is a gentleman becomes simply a way of insulting him. When a word ceases to be a term of description and becomes merely a term of praise, it no longer tells you facts about the object. It only tells you about the speaker's attitude towards that object. A nice meal only means a meal that the speaker likes, for instance. A gentleman, once it has been spiritualized and refined out of its old coarse objective sense, means hardly more than a man whom the speaker likes. As a result, gentleman is now a useless word. We had lots of terms of approval already, so it wasn't needed for that use. On the other hand, if anyone, say in a historical work, wants to use it in its old sense, he can't do so without explanations. It's been spoiled for that purpose. And there are a lot of words that have been, spoiled for the purpose they once meant. You think about words like gay, perfectly good word, and now it's been abused, right? And there are other words, of course. I just picked that one out randomly. Now, and his point is this. Now, if once we allow people to start spiritualizing and refining, or as they might say, deepening the sense of the word Christian, it too will speedily become a useless word. In the first place, Christians themselves will never be able to apply it to anyone, for it is not for us to say who, in the deepest sense, is or is not close to the Spirit of Christ. We do not see into men's hearts. We cannot judge and are indeed forbidden to judge. It would be wicked arrogance for us to say that any man is or is not a Christian in this refined sense. And obviously a word in which we can never apply is not going to be a very useful word. As for the unbelievers, they will no doubt cheerfully use the word in the refined sense. It will become in their mouths simply a term of praise. In calling anyone a Christian, they will mean that they think him a good man. But that way of using the word will be no enrichment of the language, for we already have the word good. Meanwhile, the word Christian will have been spoiled for any really useful purpose it might have served. We must therefore stick to the original obvious meaning. And this is, I think, something that we can all get behind and cheer. He says, the name Christians was first given at Antioch, Acts 11:26, to the disciples, to those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. There's no question of its being restricted to those who profited by that teaching as much as they should have. There's no question of its being extended to those who in some refined spiritual inward fashion were far closer to the Spirit of Christ than the less satisfactory of the disciples. The point is not a theological or moral one. It is only a question of using words so that we can all understand what is being said. When a man who accepts the Christian doctrine lives unworthily of it, it is much clearer to say that he is a bad Christian than to say he is not a Christian. I thought that was a really good point. I think that's... And we ought to use words in the way that they are meant to be used. You know, there are so many that are abused today. And of course, we can give plenty of biblical examples of words that are misused. The word elder, the word reverend, for instance, those kind of words. Let's use Bible words in Bible ways. I think that is a really good point. And he brings out the point I think that Philip was getting to in the last couple paragraphs here. I hope no reader will suppose that mere Christianity is put forward as an alternative to the creeds of the existing communions, as if a man could adopt it in preference to, some denominational belief system. He says it's just a gateway. It's just a presentation of, as you say, the bare bones of what being a Christian is. And so he's not, I think again, he is pointing out he is not trying to convert anyone to any particular brand, if you will, of Christianity, just rather to argue for Christianity and why we do things the way that we do, why we believe the way that we do. All right, so now we get into the presentation proper. How you like my AI picture there? I guess that's supposed to be C.S. Lewis. I let AI do this whole thing. I said, just show me a picture, what you think represents these points here. And it drew me that. I did a good job on the text, by the way. So we've had that brief overview of C.S. Lewis. This chapter that we're going to talk about establishes the foundation for Lewis's entire argument, the concept of the law of human nature as a universal moral standard. Again, I thought I did a good job with the picture there, another AI picture. So let's talk about universal moral reality. This is titled, this chapter, The Human Moral Code. Everyone has heard people arguing. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's just annoying, but these arguments can teach us something important. Listen to what they say when they argue. How would you like it if someone did that to you? Or, I was sitting there first. Or, leave him alone, he's not bothering you. Or, why do you get to go first? That sounds like my kids. Or, how about this? Give me some of your snack. I shared mine with you. Come on, you promised. People say these things every day, educated or not, kids or adults. What's interesting is that when someone says these things, they're not just saying, I don't like what you're doing. They're actually appealing to some standard of behavior they expect the other person to know about. So think about that, right? When you say that, that's not right. Or you make this statement, you promised. What does that even mean? You promised. There is a standard that underlies all of this that you expect. It's just in the social contract, right? And the person rarely responds, who cares about your standards? Instead, they usually try to explain why their actions don't actually break the standard or why they have a special excuse this time. Like, well, there's a reason why the person who sat there first shouldn't keep the seat. Or things were different when you shared your snack with me, or something came up that makes it okay for me to break my promise. The politicians do this all the time, do they not? You hear the one side will say, well, I know that normally we would think it's wrong to do this, but, I had my reasons, right? And then you have the other party will say, well, they did thus and such, and then they do the same thing and say, well, it's different when we do it. We're doing it for a good reason. So everybody likes to excuse their behavior. It looks like both people share the same idea of fairness or decent behavior, some moral code they both agree on. If they didn't share this, they might physically fight like animals. But they couldn't have a human-style argument. Arguing means trying to prove the other person is wrong, which only makes sense if you both agree on what wrong means. Just like you can't call a foul in football unless everyone agrees on the rules, right? We make sports analogies all the time. So there's got to be some underlying rules whenever you're arguing with someone about something. And you can see these are just bullet points. I won't read these to you, but this is kind of an overview of this particular section. So let's talk about the nature of moral law. He says, the moral code, or this moral code, used to be called the law of nature. Today, when we talk about laws of nature, we usually mean things like gravity or genetics, but older thinkers who talked about the law of nature actually meant human nature. The idea was that just like physical bodies follow gravity and organisms follow biological laws, humans also have their own law, with one big difference. A rock cannot choose whether to obey gravity, but a person can choose whether to obey the moral law. So we have that freedom. We are created with that freedom to choose to obey or not. We have free moral agency, as we call it. Let's put it another way. We are subjected to several different types of laws, but there's only one type we can choose to obey. As physical bodies, we're stuck with gravity. Drop someone in midair, and they'll fall like a rock with no choice in the matter. We have no choice. We cannot decide to disobey. And just as an aside, Rhonda and I were out last night. We were walking, doing a little exercise in the driveway. We walked back and forth, and something fell right behind us. I thought it was a stick. I thought it was maybe something fell off the tree until it scampered away. It was a squirrel. A squirrel had fallen at least a couple of stories out of a tree onto the concrete. I felt really bad for it. I guess it's okay.
Were you carrying on a conversation with Rhonda when suddenly you said squirrel?
No, I didn't have to, though. It did disrupt our conversation. But that squirrel, yeah, I said we need to upgrade. We need to get flying squirrels instead of these run-of-the-mill squirrels. But that squirrel didn't have a choice. It had to obey the law of gravity. As biological organisms, we're bound by biological laws just like any animal. We can't choose to disobey these laws. We share with other things, but the law unique to human nature, the one we don't share with animals, plants, or rocks, is the one that we can choose to break. It was called the law of nature because people thought everyone naturally knew it without being taught. That didn't mean you'd never find someone who didn't know it, just like you find people who are colorblind or tone deaf, but they believed that for humanity as a whole, the idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone. I mean, don't we think that? Don't we believe that? Aren't there some biblical principles at play here?
Yeah, we're made in the image of God, for one thing.
Clearly.
So we have the capacity for, holy moral concepts and feelings. And furthermore, I think through the three sons of Noah, all the world was populated.
Mm-hmm.
So traditions from the patriarchal period from revelations Noah had received were passed on. And they may be sort of opaque, or kind of ambiguous in some cultures, but all cultures have some sense of that as well.
Mm-hmm. And I can't think of it off the top of my head, but we do have this fundamental sense of right and wrong that we're born with, and I think that is, if no other reference I can give you, I will give you the one that Philip just did, and that is we're created in God's image. And so we have the capacity to know right from wrong. And God did not create us with an innate, not understanding of what right is from wrong. I believe that God does create us with that ability to distinguish and to know that some things are just wrong inherently. I think that's part of it, and I also think that it is very much part of it that we all descend from a common ancestor, and we were all taught at some level, whether it was overtly, we were told that this is right, this is wrong, or by example. These things have been inculcated into us. They are part of our common humanity. So he says his concept is, like the ancients, humanity as a whole has this idea of decent behavior that's obvious to everyone. He says, I think they were right. If they weren't, then everything we said about World War II was nonsense. What's the point of saying that the Nazis were wrong unless right is something real that they knew about too and should have followed? If they had no concept of what we mean by right, we might still have needed to fight them, but we couldn't blame them for their actions any more than we could blame them for their hair color. And I think that you've mentioned this several times before, Philip. After, what was it, the Nuremberg trials, the fact that there is, and I thought this was it the French, the French prosecutor, yeah, the word I was scrambling for, had brought this out, that there has to be this beyond the nation states, there has to be this concept of right and wrong that we appeal to as human beings.
Well, our own Justice Jackson that was sent there, I think he was administrative chief judge over it. Mm-hmm. He also made those kinds of statements. I just felt like the French prosecutor was a little more specific about the nature of that moral law being grounded in God himself. Mm-hmm. He was willing to go out on him and say that.
Yeah. So, and again, in the context of history, him bringing that up is very important, I think. So, he says, again, we might have had to fight them anyway because of their, conquest, but we couldn't have blamed them for it because it's just their opinion, right? Or it was just, that's the way they were born with that particular hair color.
Well, Chris, I don't want to interrupt the argument.
Go right ahead.
This is a splendid argument. But just to say, some might wonder if 1940s is so radically different that today the average young person will say, well, I do question the very standard they say that everybody assumed in common. I think the response would be, you may say that, but in reality, you don't really believe it. Like the other day, Charlie Kirk was having an exchange with a young college student, and the student said, I don't believe in objective morality. Kirk asked him about the Nazis. He said, did the Nazis do wrong in World War II? He said, I just said I don't believe in objective morality. So obviously, they did not. Yeah. And had Kirk begun to abuse him and to scream at him and have young guys beat him up, he would have said, hey, this is wrong. He would have felt a sense of injustice, showing nobody can get away from this law.
There's often a disconnect with, and this isn't just endemic with young people, but this happens today a lot, as I'm sure it did then. There's a disconnect between the theoretical, the philosophical, and the reality. And I think that is, going back to the previous slide, there's a universal moral reality. Okay, people expect to be treated a certain way, whether they say it, whether they claim to adhere to it or not. They expect that kind of treatment. They expect to have the golden rule applied to them. They may not espouse it, and they fight against it. But everybody deep down, at that basest of levels, the most basic of levels, understands the difference between right and wrong, and he'll get more into that argument as we go along. So he says, some people say, and I thought this was pretty interesting. So this is, again, AI's conceptualization of the various cultural, historical peoples. I see somebody dressed up like a pharaoh there. You see, looks like Asian, Roman, Greek, etc., all gathered around this table. I don't know what's written on the table, but Anyway, that was pretty cool. Some people say the idea of a universal moral code known to everyone is wrong because different civilizations and time periods have had different moralities, but that's not actually true. There have been differences, sure, but never a complete difference. If you compare the moral teachings of ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, and Romans, what's striking is how similar they are to each other and our own morality. Try to imagine a completely different morality, a country where people admire cowards who run from battle, or where someone feels proud of betraying their closest friends. It's as impossible as imagining a country where 2 + 2 = 5. That's a bad example. That did not stand the test of time very well, unfortunately. People have disagreed about who you should be unselfish toward, just your family, your fellow citizens, or everyone, but they've always agreed you shouldn't put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. People have disagreed about whether you should have 1 wife or 4, but they've always agreed you can't have just any woman you want, right? So again, there are differences, but at the core, there are so many similarities. There's got to be a commonality there at the root. Okay, this one's a little more difficult, but you understand perhaps the self-contradiction of moral relativism. So the idea here is this guy says that morality is relative, and yet when someone says you're not right, he's saying you're wrong. You can't say that. Well, how can both those things be true? You can't say that all morality is relative and then say someone's wrong about anything. The most telling thing is this: whenever you find someone who claims not to believe in objective right and wrong, watch how quickly they contradict themselves. They might break a promise to you, but if you break one to them, they'll complain, that's not fair. A country might say treaties don't matter, but then immediately undermine their argument by claiming the treaty they want to break was unfair. But if treaties don't matter, and there's no such thing as right and wrong, no law of nature, what makes a treaty fair or unfair? Haven't they revealed that despite what they say, they know the moral law just like everyone else? Again, it's just this convenient, I don't want to do the right thing, and so I'm going to find a convenient reason to do the wrong thing and justify it in my own mind so I don't feel bad about it. But they do. They know the moral law just like everyone else. So it seems we have to believe in real right and wrong. People might sometimes be mistaken about them, just like people sometimes get math problems wrong, but they're not just matters of opinion or taste. And then he talks about universal moral failure. Now, if we agree on that, here's my next point. None of us are actually keeping this moral law. If there are any exceptions among you, I apologize. They should read something else because what I'm saying doesn't apply to them. For the rest of us ordinary humans, please don't misunderstand what I'm about to say. I'm not preaching, and I definitely don't claim to be better than anyone else. I'm just pointing out a fact. Today, this month, or probably even today, we've failed to We've probably failed to behave the way we expect others to behave. So we fail constantly, don't we? We do things. We expect other people to do things the right way, and yet we fail at ourselves. That's his point. We might have all kinds of excuses. Maybe you were unfair to your kids because you were exhausted. That questionable financial decision you've almost forgotten about happened when you were really broke. And that thing you promised to do for someone but never did, well, you wouldn't have promised if you'd known how busy you'd be. As for how you treat your spouse or your siblings, if I knew how annoying they could be, I wouldn't blame you. And who am I to judge anyway? I'm just the same. I don't follow the moral law very well either, and the moment anyone points that out, my mind produces a long list of excuses. Right now, the question isn't whether these are good excuses. The point is that making excuses proves how deeply we believe in the moral law. If we didn't believe in decent behavior, why would we be so eager to explain why we haven't behaved decently? The truth is, we believe in decency so strongly, we feel the pressure of the moral law so much that we can't bear to admit we're breaking it. So we try to shift responsibility. Notice that we only make these explanations for our bad behavior. We blame our bad temper on being tired, worried, hungry, but we take credit for our own good moods. These are really good arguments, I think. These are things that, again, we'll get into this in a lot more detail, and we'll make some applications scripturally. But to conclude this first session here are the 2 points I wanted to make, he says. First, humans everywhere have this strange idea that they should behave a certain way, and they can't shake this feeling. Second, they don't actually behave that way. They know the moral law, and they break it. These two facts are the foundation for clearly understanding ourselves and the universe we live in. This is a very interesting argument that he makes. We all intrinsically know that there is a difference between right and wrong, and yet we continue to fail. And of course, this is the beginning of the argument that because there is this moral law, because there are things that we know to do and we don't do them, we break the law, we don't obey these moral laws, we fail to live up to them, and this causes what we would call sin, of course, and it requires that there be some remedy for the sin. And again, we'll get into that perhaps more in subsequent lessons, but again, that is the foundation that we're laying here, is that there is a law, you can break it, and when you do, you've transgressed the law, you've failed the law, you feel bad about it so much that you make excuses for why you did it, and it's unsustainable to live like that. You cannot live in that condition indefinitely spiritually when you know that you continue to fail. There must be some remedy for that, and of course, that remedy ultimately is Christ, the Christian way of living, Christianity. So that's what he'll get into, but we'll cut it for right there. Let me